The Ottoman Empire's darkest secret began not with a sword, but with a spreadsheet. In the winter of 1515, officials arrived in a Bulgarian village with leather-bound ledgers, cataloguing Christian boys with the cold precision of a tax collector. A 7-year-old's name was reduced to an inventory number. Within days, he was torn from his screaming mother and marched toward a fate determined by brutal mathematics. He was one of thousands taken that year through a system that operated with shocking mortality rates, calculated and accepted as the cost of business. This was the Devshirme system, a 600-year-old bureaucratic machine of child collection, meticulously documented in the empire's own archives. This was not random cruelty. This was state-sanctioned, industrial-scale horror. But how did an empire transform child abduction into a science that operated into the 20th century? What drove desperate parents to harm their own children to save them from the collectors? And what happened to the hundreds of thousands of women and boys sold in Constantinople's markets? This is the suppressed history of a system so vast and so brutal, it challenges everything you thought you knew about the civilized world. But here's where the Ottoman Empire's exploitation begins. Not in dark alleys or criminal hideouts, but in government offices with leather-bound ledgers. The Devshirme system wasn't some underground trafficking ring, it was official state policy, complete with quotas, schedules, and quality control standards that would make modern bureaucrats dizzy. Picture this. It's 1515 in the small Bulgarian village of Koprivshtitsa. Ottoman officials arrive not as raiders or criminals, but as government employees carrying official documents. They have leather-bound ledgers listing every Christian family, every son, every potential candidate for collection. Here's what most people don't realize. These weren't random kidnappings. The Ottomans had transformed child abduction into a science, with specific criteria: boys between 7 and 20, preferably healthy, physically strong, and from specific regions known for producing quality candidates. The truly disturbing part? They kept receipts. Document number 3, 1008, 147, in the Constantinople archives, shows village quotas for the 1515 collection. Koprivshtitsa owed 23 boys. The nearby village of Panagirishta owed 31, and Pazarjic owed 47. These numbers weren't arbitrary. Ottoman statisticians calculated them based on population density, previous collection yields, and the empire's current needs for soldiers and servants. Marko Dimitrov's case reveals the horrifying efficiency of the system. The 7-year-old's name appeared in the ledgers months before officials arrived. They knew his age, his father's occupation, blacksmith, even noted his physical health and appearance. When officials came that December morning, they didn't need to search. They went directly to his house, ledger in hand, and checked his name off their list like a delivery service confirming a package pickup. But wait, it gets worse. The officials examining these boys treated them exactly like livestock at market. They conducted medical examinations, inspected for physical defects, assessed potential for various roles. One French diplomat, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, witnessed a collection in 1631 and wrote, "The Turkish officials handled the boys as our merchants handle horses," conducting thorough physical assessments to determine their future placement. The 1522 Serbian uprising, FIS, which your history teacher probably never mentioned, erupted specifically because Ottoman collectors had increased quotas by 40%. Villages that previously lost 20 boys now faced demands for 28. The breaking point came when officials arrived in the town of Užice demanding 67 boys, including several who were only 6 years old. The ensuing rebellion left 3,000 dead, but here's the truly twisted part. The Ottoman response wasn't to end the practice. It was to improve their record-keeping to prevent future inventory disputes. Let's talk numbers, because the scale will blow your mind. Between 1450 and 1650, the Devshirme system's peak, historians estimate the Ottomans collected between 200,000 and 500,000 Christian boys. That's an average of 2,500 boys per year, every year, for 2 centuries. Imagine if the IRS kept detailed records of your children, not for tax deductions, but for scheduled collection. Imagine government officials arriving with spreadsheets showing which of your kids they'd be taking, when, and for what purpose. The religious justification makes it even more insidious. Ottoman scholars argued they were saving these Christian boys by converting them to Islam. Sultan Murad II's chief Islamic judge issued a fatwa in 1432, declaring the practice not just legal but virtuous. 9. They were bringing infidel children into the light of true faith. Never mind that this salvation involved tearing children from their families and subjecting them to brutal training programs. The system evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated and horrifying. Initially focused on creating janissaries, elite soldiers, by the 1500s, officials were specifically selecting boys for other purposes. Palace records show categories like hazinadar, treasury servants, icholan, palace pages, and various specialized roles requiring different training programs. The documentary precision is what makes this so chilling. These weren't crimes hidden in shadows. They were government programs with annual reports. The 1561 Devshirme Register from Bosnia lists 1,017 boys collected, including their names, ages, villages, and physical descriptions. Next to 9-year-old Dorde from Sarajevo, an official noted his health status and potential aptitude for palace service. That bureaucratic note sealed a child's fate as surely as a court verdict. Regional preferences developed based on perceived qualities. Albanian boys were preferred for their supposed loyalty, Bosnians for their height, Greeks for their intelligence, and various other ethnic stereotypes that Ottoman officials codified into selection criteria. Ottoman officials literally developed a classification system for child collection, complete with guidelines and quality ratings that would make modern human resources departments look disorganized. Parents faced an impossible choice. Some tried bribing officials. The going rate to save a son was 50 gold coins, equivalent to 5 years' income for a peasant family. Others married their sons off early, as married boys were supposedly exempt. But here's what most people don't realize. By 1540, Ottoman collectors were taking married boys anyway, sometimes as young as 12, leaving child brides widowed before they'd even reached adulthood. The most heartbreaking accounts come from the mothers. A Serbian folk song from the period goes, 9 sons I bore, 9 sons I raised, 9 sons the Turks have taken. Now I birth only tears, I nurse only sorrow. My womb is a grave, my breasts give poison. These weren't metaphorical lyrics. Women who lost all their sons to the Devshirme often fell into deep depression, unable to bear the thought of their children's unknown fate. If you thought systematic child abduction was horrifying, wait until you discover what happened to these boys after their names were erased from their family records and added to the Ottoman inventory. The real nightmare wasn't the collection. It was the complete destruction of everything these children had ever been. The real nightmare wasn't the abduction. It was the systematic erasure of everything these children had ever been. The Ottoman Empire didn't just take bodies. They perfected the art of destroying identities while keeping the person alive for future service. The process began the moment boys were loaded onto transport wagons. Here's what most people don't realize. The identity destruction started immediately, not gradually. Boys were forbidden from speaking to each other in their native languages. Turkish-speaking guards enforced strict language rules. Imagine being 7 years old, terrified, and not even allowed to speak in the only language you knew. Take the case of Ahmed, formerly Alexandros, a 10-year-old Greek boy collected in 1543. Ottoman training records from the Enderun school document his progress with chilling precision. Week 1, still responds to birth name, correction applied. Week 4, no longer responds to original name. Week 12, has learned basic Turkish prayers. By month 6, this child had been completely reprogrammed. The truly disturbing part? The Ottomans considered this a success story. The 1547 incident at the Galata training facility reveals how thoroughly the system crushed any remnant of identity. Guards discovered 50 boys communicating in Serbian during rest periods. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Each boy was forced to denounce his homeland and reject his past identity. 3 boys who refused were subjected to extended isolation. When they emerged, witnesses reported they had difficulty communicating in any language. But wait, it gets worse. The Ottoman training manual, Kanunname i Hitisab i Istanbul, contains specific instructions for identity transformation. Chapter 3, titled On Creating New Men, recommends the child must be made to understand his previous life was incomplete. All memories of family and homeland must be replaced with loyalty to the Sultan. When the child embraces his new identity completely, the transformation succeeds. Physical transformation accompanied mental reconstruction. Boys' appearances were standardized, boy-specific haircuts, identical uniforms, regulated behaviors. Everyone wore the same rough wool garments, ate identical meals at identical times, slept in identical positions. The message was clear. You are not an individual. You are part of the Sultan's property. The Ottoman Empire pioneered what modern psychologists would recognize as systematic identity reformation. Boys were subjected to intense indoctrination, NAA, not through random cruelty, but through calculated programs designed to replace their original identity with complete loyalty to the Ottoman system. One survivor, later known as Hassan Pasha, wrote in his memoirs, "I learned to forget the child I had been, for those memories brought only confusion and pain." Language transformation was particularly intense. Boys caught speaking their native tongue faced escalating punishments. The truly twisted part? They were then forced to learn Ottoman Turkish through memorizing phrases that reinforced their new identity. Imagine a child having to repeat loyalty oaths hundreds of times daily in a foreign language, until those became the only words he knew. The Enderun school records from 1562 to 1598 show the effectiveness of this psychological transformation. Of 3,847 boys processed through the facility, the vast majority completely adapted to their new identities within 1 year. Those who couldn't adapt to the system faced increasingly harsh measures or were redirected to different roles. Sleep regulation amplified the identity transformation. Boys were woken at specific times for prayers and training, creating a rhythm that disrupted normal childhood development patterns. After weeks of this, exhausted minds couldn't maintain grip on fading memories. The 1578 testimony of Italian ambassador Lorenzo Bernardo describes visiting the training facility. The boys moved with mechanical precision, all individuality erased through relentless routine. Here's a detail that reveals the system's sophistication. The Ottomans created structured programs to replace family bonds with institutional loyalty. Boys were assigned to small groups that became their new families, with older recruits serving as brothers and supervisors as fathers. These artificial relationships were enforced through reward and punishment systems that made boys dependent on their new social structure. The physical environment reinforced psychological transformation. Training facilities were designed to be completely alien to anything familiar. No churches, no Christian symbols, no foods from home, no familiar landscapes visible from windows. Boys were moved between facilities regularly to prevent any geographical attachment. The architecture itself was disorienting. Large communal spaces, endless identical corridors, no private areas where a boy might maintain any sense of individual identity. But the most effective aspect was the merit system. Boys who adapted fastest, who embraced their Ottoman identity most completely, received privileges, FDS, better food, warmer clothes, eventually positions of authority. This created a competitive dynamic where children were incentivized to abandon their past. The boy who mastered Turkish first got extra bread. The one who excelled in Islamic studies earned a wool blanket. Imagine the psychological pressure of needing warmth so badly you forced yourself to excel at forgetting your past. The Ottoman trainers understood something terrifying about human psychology. Identity could be completely reshaped through systematic intervention. They created a system so effective that many Devshirme graduates later participated enthusiastically in collecting the next generation of Christian boys. These men had been so thoroughly transformed that they applied the same system to others without hesitation. By the time boys graduated from initial training, they were psychologically transformed. One French observer wrote in 1605, "To speak with a janissary who was born Christian is to converse with a man who has no past. The boy who existed before exists no longer. In his place stands an Ottoman creation, complete in loyalty because he has no other identity to return to." This identity transformation was just preparation for what came next. But erasing their identities was just preparation for the true horror, the various fates that awaited these boys in the Ottoman system. The Ottoman Empire didn't just steal children, they operated a vast system of exploitation where human beings were treated as resources to be processed and utilized. The mortality rates at various stages of this system reveal its true brutality. The mathematics of this horror are staggering. The 1598 records from training facilities across the empire show the industrial scale of loss. That year alone, they processed 10,000 boys through various programs. The documented outcomes reveal a system that treated human wastage as an acceptable business expense. They literally calculated death rates into their recruitment quotas. The medical procedures many boys endured had catastrophic mortality rates. Ottoman documents simply refer to various modifications and preparations that boys underwent for different roles. Those who survived often faced lifelong health complications. The empire had medicalized child exploitation into a science. Take Ibrahim's account, one of the few first-hand testimonies we have. Subjected to harsh training at age 8 in 1574, he survived to become a palace servant, and later wrote, "The physical hardships were not the worst part. The worst was the complete loss of who we had been. We who survived were changed forever, unable to return to our families, even if freed, because we no longer knew how to be the sons they had lost." But wait, it gets even more twisted. The Ottoman Empire had different training paths for different purposes, and the selection process reveals calculated cruelty. Boys were sorted based on physical attributes, intelligence, and perceived aptitudes. Some were trained for military service, others for administrative roles, and many for personal service in Ottoman households. Here's what most people don't realize. This sorting wasn't random. It was a calculated system based on centuries of experience. Boys from certain regions were preferentially selected for specific roles. The empire literally created a human resources department for exploited children, complete with assessment criteria and placement protocols. The training facilities were essentially factories for producing different types of servants. Boys underwent years of indoctrination, skill training, and preparation for their assigned roles. The curriculum, preserved in Ottoman administrative documents, shows systematic approaches to creating soldiers, administrators, and personal servants. They had literally created an education system based on exploitation. The economic calculations behind this system reveal the Ottoman Empire's true depravity. Palace records show detailed cost-benefit analyses of different training programs. The expense of feeding, housing, and training boys was weighed against their expected future value. Some programs with higher mortality rates continued because the survivors were considered more valuable. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a business model built on child exploitation. The truly disturbing part? They kept trying to improve the system, not to reduce suffering but for efficiency. Ottoman administrative texts from the period describe various innovations in training methods, living conditions, and selection criteria. One Ottoman official wrote a treatise in 1465 titled "On the Optimal Utilization of Collected Youth" that reads like a management consultant's handbook for exploitation. Seasonal patterns emerged in this industrial system. Most collections occurred in spring when travel was easier. Training programs were scheduled around agricultural cycles and military campaigns. The empire developed a horrifying efficiency, processing thousands of boys annually through various facilities. Imagine a modern corporation scheduling child exploitation like quarterly business planning. The age selection process was equally calculated. Different ages were preferred for different roles. Younger boys were considered more adaptable for certain positions, while older ones might be fast-tracked to military service. The optimal age for various purposes was determined through centuries of trial and error. The Ottoman Empire had literally optimized child exploitation through data analysis. Survival didn't mean the horror ended. Boys who completed training faced uncertain futures in Ottoman service. Many died young from the hardships they endured. Others lived their entire lives in servitude, never able to return home or create families of their own. Ottoman records describe former Devshirme boys dying decades later, still in service, having never experienced freedom. Here's a detail that reveals the system's scope. The training facilities required massive infrastructure. Dormitories, classrooms, training grounds, medical facilities, all dedicated to processing children into servants. The construction and maintenance of these facilities employed thousands. An entire economy developed around the exploitation of Christian children. The geographical distribution of training facilities shows strategic planning. Major centers in Constantinople, Anatolia, and the Balkans allowed efficient processing of boys from different regions. Transportation networks connected collection points to training centers to final destinations. The logistics required reveal the Ottoman Empire's commitment to child exploitation as a core state function. The record-keeping was meticulous. Ottoman archives contain thousands of documents tracking boys through the system, collection records, training evaluations, placement decisions, death certificates. Each boy became a series of bureaucratic entries, his humanity reduced to administrative data. These records now serve as testimony to one of history's most systematic exploitation networks. Regional variations in the system adapted to local conditions. In some areas, collection was annual. In others, it occurred every few years. Some regions faced higher quotas due to population density or perceived quality of recruits. The Ottoman Empire literally optimized its child exploitation based on regional demographics. The psychological impact extended beyond the boys themselves. Entire communities lived in fear of collection day. Families with young sons faced constant anxiety. The social fabric of Christian communities was torn apart by the regular loss of their children. Generational trauma affected regions for centuries. But here's the most chilling aspect. This system was so normalized that Ottoman officials discussed collection quotas and training outcomes, like modern bureaucrats discuss tax revenues. A 1634 report to the Sultan notes, "This year's collection has yielded satisfactory results, with above-average placement rates in military units. We recommend maintaining current quotas for optimal system performance." Those who survived the training system faced various fates, but many ended up in another horrific Ottoman institution, Isel, the entertainment industry that turned exploitation into public spectacle. The boys who survived training weren't freed. They were often transformed into entertainers in the Ottoman Empire's disturbing performance culture. The Köçek tradition turned child exploitation into public entertainment that would shock modern audiences. Picture this scene from 1650s Constantinople. In an upscale entertainment house near the Grand Bazaar, Ottoman elites gather for an evening of cultural performance. The main attraction, young performers, typically starting their careers between ages 12 and 16, executing elaborate dances, while audiences showered them with coins and competed for their attention. This wasn't hidden in criminal underground. This was mainstream entertainment, as normal as attending the theatre. The Köçek performers were exclusively young males who performed in elaborate costumes. Here's what most people don't realize. Many were specifically selected from the Devshirme system for their grace and appearance. The Ottoman Empire had created a pipeline from child collection to entertainment industry, with the same bureaucratic efficiency they applied to tax collection. The training process for Köçek performers was as systematic as it was intensive. Boys spent years learning not just dance moves, but music, poetry, and entertainment skills. Ottoman training manuals describe in detail how performers should move, dress, and interact with audiences. The entertainment guilds maintained strict standards for their performers. The 1650 riot at Sultanahmet reveals just how popular this entertainment had become. The incident started when two Ottoman officials began competing for the attention of a particularly talented Köçek performer named Yahya. The competition escalated into a physical confrontation. Their respective entourages joined in, and by morning, 12 people were dead, and a city block was burned. The truly twisted part? The Ottoman authorities' response wasn't to ban such entertainment. It was to regulate the competition rules to prevent future disruptions. European diplomats documented these performances with fascination and concern. French ambassador Marquis de Nointel wrote in 1674, "The Turks gather in great numbers to watch young men perform elaborate dances. The audience shows their appreciation with gold coins and gifts. The most talented performers achieve celebrity status and can command impressive fees for private performances." The guild system that managed Köçek performers operated with the same structure as legitimate trade organizations. The Istanbul Entertainment Guild, established in 1577, had regulations, apprenticeship programs, and even retirement plans for performers who aged out of the profession. It functioned as a professional organization for young entertainers, complete with standards and hierarchies. But wait, it gets worse. The Köçek performances were stratified by the performers' backgrounds and talents. Former Devshirme boys who showed artistic ability might find themselves in this profession. Different venues catered to different social classes. From elite private performances to public street entertainment, the most talented performers could achieve significant fame and fortune. The memoirs of Mehmet, a former Köçek performer who worked from 1702 to 1710, provide rare first-hand insight into this world. He describes being selected for entertainment training at age 11, spending years perfecting his craft, then performing for audiences across the empire. His account emphasizes the artistic demands of the profession and the celebrity culture that surrounded top performers. The economics of Köçek entertainment reveal its centrality to Ottoman culture. Top performers could earn 50 gold dinars per performance, more than most craftsmen made in a year. Of course, young performers rarely controlled their own earnings. Their trainers and managers kept most profits, creating an exploitative system that enriched adults at the expense of young entertainers. Public performances followed elaborate protocols. Performers would execute complex choreographies, often accompanied by live music. They demonstrated years of training in every movement, maintaining the artistic standards their guilds demanded. The audiences, ranging from merchants to military officers, showed their appreciation through monetary gifts thrown onto the performance space. The patronage system that developed around performers was particularly notable. Wealthy Ottomans would sponsor promising young entertainers, paying for their training and expenses in exchange for exclusive performances. These sponsorships could last years and often launched careers. The most successful performers might eventually establish their own entertainment troupes. The psychological demands on performers were significant. Many Kerchak performers struggled with the pressures of public performance, the loss of privacy, and the intense competition within the profession. The Ottoman response was to create support systems within the guilds, including housing for performers and retirement provisions for those who aged out of the profession. Cultural impact extended beyond the entertainment venues. Ottoman poetry and literature from the period is filled with references to Kerchak performers, usually celebrating their artistic abilities. Prominent poets wrote odes to talented performers, comparing their movements to flowing water or soaring birds. This cultural production normalized the entertainment system. Here's perhaps the most striking statistic. At the height of the Kerchak tradition in the late 1600s, Istanbul alone had an estimated 3,000 active performers. That's 3,000 young men working in the entertainment industry in a single city, with thousands more across the empire. The infrastructure required training schools, performance venues, guild organizations, shows this wasn't a marginal phenomenon, but a major cultural institution. The Kerchak system finally faced restrictions in the 1850s, not due to child welfare concerns, but because European criticism threatened diplomatic relationships. Even then, it wasn't abolished immediately, just regulated and gradually phased out. The last official Kerchak guild didn't close until 1871, and private performances continued into the 20th century. While boys faced exploitation in the entertainment industry, the empire had constructed an even larger system for enslaving women in what would become history's most extensive forced servitude operation. If you thought the treatment of boys was horrifying, the Ottoman Empire's female slave trade operated on a scale that turned Constantinople into history's largest human trafficking hub. At any given moment, the city held an estimated 300,000 enslaved women, with thousands more flowing through the markets each month. The 1576 market records from the Suleymaniye commercial complex paint a picture of industrial-scale human trafficking. Daily sales averaged 200 to 300 women, with special market days seeing up to 1,000 women sold. But here's what most people don't realize. These weren't hidden criminal operations. They were official state-sanctioned markets, complete with tax collectors, standardized pricing, and quality certifications. The price lists are perhaps the most damning evidence of the Ottoman Empire's systematic slavery. The market documents differentiate between various categories of enslaved women based on their intended roles and attributes. Prices varied dramatically based on age, origin, and perceived qualities. They literally had a pricing algorithm for human beings. The training compounds reveal the industrial approach to slavery. These weren't random holdings. They were education centers, where enslaved women learned Turkish, Ottoman customs, music, dance, and household management. The 1623 inspection report of the Haseki compound describes dormitories for 500 women, classrooms for language instruction, and specialized training areas for various skills. Take the famous case of Roxilana, who rose from slavery to become Sultan Suleiman's wife. History presents this as a romance, but let's be clear, she was a teenage girl, captured from her Ukrainian village, sold in Constantinople's slave market, and selected for the palace. That she later gained power doesn't erase that she started as a trafficking victim who had to navigate an impossible system to survive. The source regions for enslaved women were carefully categorized based on Ottoman preferences. Different regions were known for providing women with different characteristics, and the empire's traders developed extensive networks to maintain supply. The Ottoman Empire had created a vast trafficking network that spanned 3 continents. Here's a disturbing detail your history teacher definitely didn't mention: the inspection process at slave markets. Women were subjected to detailed physical examinations by potential buyers, with health and appearance being primary factors in determining price. A 1651 French merchant's account describes the dehumanizing conditions of these markets, where human beings were evaluated like livestock. The scale of Constantinople's slave markets dwarfs any other historical example. The city had multiple major slave markets and dozens of smaller ones. The largest could process thousands of people monthly. To put this in perspective, imagine a city where hundreds of thousands lived in bondage, with markets operating as normally as modern shopping centers. The training facilities operated with systematic efficiency. Young women were taught languages, arts, and skills that would increase their value. The curriculum, preserved in Ottoman administrative documents, includes lessons in Turkish, Persian, Arabic, music, and household management. They had literally created schools within the slavery system. Transport networks feeding Constantinople's markets were vast and sophisticated. Slave caravans from various regions could include hundreds of people at a time. Ships brought captives from around the Black Sea. North African traders supplied women from Mediterranean regions. The logistics required to move hundreds of thousands of people across continents reveals the Ottoman Empire's commitment to slavery as a core economic sector. But here's the truly disturbing part: the legal framework that enabled this horror. Ottoman law considered slaves property with specific rights and obligations. The legal system regulated everything from sale contracts to inheritance of slaves. Children born to enslaved mothers typically inherited their mother's status. The law created a comprehensive framework for human ownership. The psychological impact extended beyond physical bondage. Women were renamed upon enslavement, forbidden from maintaining connections to their past lives, and punished for showing attachment to their origins. Many were converted to Islam, creating additional barriers to ever returning home. The system was designed to erase previous identities and create dependence. The economic impact of slavery on the Ottoman Empire was massive. Conservative estimates suggest the slave trade generated significant portions of Istanbul's total economic activity. Thousands of people, traders, trainers, guards, transporters, made their living from this industry. When European diplomats suggested abolishing slavery, Ottoman officials argued it would cause economic collapse. Palace records reveal the Sultan's household alone contained thousands of enslaved women at its peak. These weren't willing participants in some exotic Oriental fantasy, They were captives held against their will, subjected to a rigid hierarchy where advancement meant gaining favor with their captors. The palace slavery system became a model replicated throughout elite Ottoman households. The market records also revealed disturbing demographic patterns. Young women commanded the highest prices, with value decreasing with age. Women with children were often sold together, though families were frequently separated based on buyer preferences. The fate of these families represents another layer of Ottoman cruelty. Health conditions in slave markets were often catastrophic. Thousands of people packed into confined spaces led to disease outbreaks. Major plagues that devastated Constantinople often started in the overcrowded slave markets. But rather than improve conditions, Ottoman authorities simply increased imports to replace losses. Here's a statistic that reveals the true scale. Between 1500 and 1800, historians estimate millions of women passed through Ottoman slave markets. The infrastructure required, the effort, from slave ships to auction houses to training facilities, shows this wasn't a side business, but a central pillar of Ottoman society. The demographic mysteries in Ottoman records tell their own disturbing story about what happened to evidence of this systematic exploitation. The most damning evidence of Ottoman exploitation isn't in what their records show, it's in what they don't show. The demographic impossibility revealed in Ottoman census data tells a story of systematic erasure that historians are only beginning to understand. Consider this statistical mystery. The 1612 Ottoman census shows Constantinople's population included 300,000 enslaved women and approximately 200,000 Ottoman men of reproductive age. Basic mathematics suggests this should have produced a significant mixed population over time, yet Ottoman demographic records show virtually no mixed heritage population. This absence raises disturbing questions that Ottoman records deliberately obscure. Historical testimonies collected by European diplomats provide troubling hints. Maria, a Greek midwife who worked in Constantinople from 1598 to 1621, gave sworn testimony to Venetian officials about practices in Ottoman households that would explain these demographic anomalies. Her accounts suggest systematic efforts to prevent or eliminate evidence of relationships between Ottoman men and enslaved women. Archaeological evidence supports these testimonies. Excavations near former slave compounds have uncovered burial sites that tell their own grim stories. The 2003 dig at the former Husaki Sultan complex revealed cemetery areas with unusual demographic patterns, far more young women and infants than would be expected from natural mortality rates. But wait, it gets worse. The systematic nature of demographic manipulation reveals Ottoman institutional involvement. Palace records from 1634 include budget line items for household management services and demographic control measures. They literally budgeted for hiding evidence of exploitation as a fin de vie, routine administrative expense. The Ottoman legal framework enabled these practices through deliberate ambiguities. While Islamic law theoretically provided certain protections, Ottoman interpretations created loopholes for maintaining social order and family integrity. A 1582 legal opinion declared that maintaining clear lineages was essential for social stability, providing legal cover for disturbing practices. Survivor accounts from enslaved women are heartbreaking beyond words. Sultana, a Circassian woman enslaved in 1642, later testified about the fate of women who became pregnant in Ottoman households. Her accounts describe systematic efforts to prevent certain births from being recorded, suggesting a dark explanation for the demographic mysteries in official records. Ottoman medical texts from the period, written in oblique language, reference household health management and preventing complications. These euphemistic passages, when decoded by modern historians, reveal systematic approaches to demographic control that would explain the absence of mixed populations in official records. The cultural hierarchy in Ottoman society created additional pressures. Mixed heritage individuals faced severe social disabilities, being accepted neither by Ottoman elites nor by enslaved populations. This social reality created incentives for concealing or eliminating evidence of such heritage, contributing to their absence from official records. Here's perhaps the most disturbing aspect: the psychological impact on women who lived under constant threat of demographic erasure. Many women attempted to avoid pregnancy through various means rather than face uncertain outcomes. Others experienced severe mental trauma from losses that could never be officially acknowledged. Ottoman medical records show high rates of female hysteria among enslaved populations, likely trauma from systematic exploitation. The economic motivations behind demographic control were clear. Mixed heritage individuals complicated the slave system, raising questions about legal status and inheritance. Their existence threatened the clear boundaries between enslaved and free populations that the Ottoman economy depended on. The empire viewed demographic clarity as essential to maintaining their exploitation system. The scale becomes clear when examining population statistics over time. Despite millions of enslaved women passing through Ottoman territories over 4 centuries, genetic studies of modern Turkish populations show surprisingly little African or Slavic heritage. This genetic absence corroborates historical accounts of systematic demographic manipulation. International observers documented these practices but were powerless to intervene. The Austrian ambassador's 1663 report states, "The Turks maintained strict separation between their own bloodlines and those of their slaves through methods that Christian conscience cannot contemplate." The absence of mixed populations in a society with so many enslaved women defies natural explanation. The Ottoman response to international criticism was denial and obfuscation. When European diplomats raised concerns, Ottoman officials produced carefully edited records showing normal demographic patterns. They claimed high infant mortality rates explained any anomalies, but the selective nature of these mortality rates raised more questions than answers. Religious authorities' complicity extended to providing theological justifications for demographic control. Certain religious opinions sanctioned practices aimed at maintaining pure lineages, providing spiritual cover for systematic exploitation. The religious establishment that should have protected the vulnerable instead enabled their erasure. This systematic demographic manipulation represents perhaps the darkest chapter in Ottoman slavery. The empire that meticulously documented every administrative detail somehow lost track of entire populations. The only records that exist are in the silence, the demographic void where mixed populations should have been. Parents, faced with this system, made an impossible choice: harm their own children, or lose them to Ottoman collectors who would subject them to these horrors. The Ottoman system was so horrific that loving parents chose to permanently harm their own children rather than see them taken. This isn't metaphor or exaggeration. We have documented evidence of entire villages organizing to disable their children as an act of desperate love. The village of Koprivštitsa's 1689 incident stands as one of history's most heartbreaking examples of parental desperation. When news arrived that Ottoman collectors would arrive within the month, the village elders made an unthinkable decision. Over 3 nights, parents systematically disabled their children through various means. By the time Ottoman officials arrived, 89 of the village's 92 eligible boys were too damaged for collection. Father Dimitri's documented confession, preserved in the monastery archives of Rila, provides a window into a parent's impossible choice. In 1654, he partially blinded his 8-year-old son Georgi rather than see him taken. His written confession reads, "I harmed my beautiful boy to save him from a worse fate. His cries haunt me, but I pray God will forgive what love made necessary. Better my son live with disability than die in Turkish service." Ottoman records increasingly complained about damaged goods as communities developed systematic strategies to make their children undesirable for collection. A 1697 report from Bosnia notes, "The Christian dogs have learned to mark their children like diseased cattle. In village after village, we find boys with disabilities that seem suspiciously common. The locals claim accidents, but the patterns suggest coordinated action." But here's what most people don't realize. Communities developed sophisticated strategies to create disabilities that would save lives while minimizing permanent harm. Controlled injuries that would heal poorly but not fatally, temporary conditions that appeared permanent, elaborate deceptions involving fake disabilities. Parents became experts in non-fatal harm that would protect their children. The psychological trauma of these decisions haunted families for generations. Imagine looking at your child's perfect face and knowing you had hours to alter it. Parents who couldn't bring themselves to harm their children often begged neighbors to do it instead. The Bulgarian folk song, Mother's Tears, tells of a woman who saved her son through disability while singing him lullabies to calm his terror. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Skeletal remains from Christian villages during the Ottoman period show unusual patterns of childhood injuries. AS. Too many to be coincidental, too similar to be random. Healed breaks in specific bones, facial trauma that matches deliberate patterns, missing digits that suggest intentional removal. These bones tell stories of parental love expressed through calculated harm. The Ottoman response to parental interventions was predictably cruel. When collectors encountered villages with too many disabled children, they sometimes took them anyway as punishment. The 1702 incident in Serbia saw officials collecting 23 boys with various disabilities, declaring that damaged goods would serve as examples to others who think to cheat the Sultan's due. Some interventions were more extreme than others. In desperate communities, parents induced permanent disabilities, damaged hearing, or created visible deformities. The calculation was brutal but clear. A living disabled child was better than a dead or enslaved whole one. Medical texts from the period describe treating children for injuries that could only have been deliberately inflicted by someone who loved them. The economic impact of widespread disability shaped entire regions. Villages known for accidents faced higher taxes and more frequent collections. This created a horrific economy where communities had to balance how many children they could afford to disable against how many they could afford to lose. Some villages designated certain families to sacrifice their children so others could claim disability. Here's a truly disturbing detail. Ottoman officials eventually created inspection protocols to distinguish real disabilities from intentional harm. The 1718 manual includes detailed descriptions of how to identify deliberately inflicted injuries. They literally created a forensic science of detecting parental love expressed through harm. Religious authorities faced impossible moral dilemmas. Orthodox priests were asked to bless children before their disablement, to pray over parents about to harm their babies. Some refused and watched their congregation's children taken. Others participated, developing theological justifications for harming children to save their souls. The theological debates from this period explore the ethics of necessary evil in impossible circumstances. The long-term psychological effects on deliberately disabled children were complex. Many grew up understanding their disabilities as acts of love. Others resented their limitations, especially as Ottoman power waned and the danger passed. Generational trauma passed from parents who inflicted harm to children who bore it to grandchildren who inherited the psychological scars. Statistical analysis of birth records shows suspicious patterns. In regions facing imminent collection, birth rates for boys mysteriously dropped while reported stillbirth rates soared. Were parents making even more desperate choices? Were midwives complicit in protecting newborns through deception? The numbers suggest systematic efforts to hide or protect male children from future collection. Professional networks emerged in some regions to assist parents. These were specialists who understood how to create survivable disabilities, how to make temporary conditions appear permanent, how to minimize long-term harm while maximizing protection. Parents paid these experts to professionally disable their children because amateur attempts might fail or prove fatal. By the late Ottoman period, an estimated 1 in 4 Christian children in collection zones bore deliberate disabilities. Entire generations grew up marked by their parents' desperate love. Villages were populated by those bearing scars of salvation, line-eyed, the limping, the partially sighted, the disfigured, all bearing witness to what parents would do to save their children from a worse fate. These weren't ancient practices lost to time. They continued until shockingly recently, within the memory of people still living today. Remember 7-year-old Marko Dimitrov from our opening Golem 3, row 17 in that Ottoman ledger? Historical records show he was renamed Yusuf, survived the brutal training system that claimed thousands of other boys in his cohort, and spent 40 years in palace service before dying without ever learning what happened to his family. His story multiplied by 500,000 represents the true legacy of the Ottoman Empire. Not the architectural marvels or military conquests you learn about in school, but a 6th century system of industrialized exploitation that operated with spreadsheet efficiency. The bureaucrats who catalogued Christian children for collection, the officials who oversaw training facilities with catastrophic mortality rates, the traders who differentiated human prices based on origin and attributes, MCAT, they all contributed to history's most systematic exploitation network. Those leather-bound ledgers still exist in Istanbul's archives, each entry a child taken, a life transformed, a family shattered. The Ottoman Empire didn't just practice slavery, it perfected human exploitation into state policy. This history reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and institutional evil. The Ottoman Empire wasn't uniquely monstrous, they simply documented their atrocities better than most. When power operates without accountability, when certain humans are classified as property, when religious or cultural superiority justifies exploitation, these horrors become inevitable. Modern human trafficking, which enslaves an estimated 40 million people globally, follows patterns established centuries ago. The same dehumanization, the same bureaucratic efficiency, the same exploitation hiding behind legitimate institutions. The difference is that today we call it criminal. Then, it was imperial policy. The Ottoman officials who maintained those child collection spreadsheets probably went home to their own families, kissed their own children goodnight, never seeing themselves as monsters, just administrators following orders. That's the most terrifying lesson. How ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil when the system normalizes it. The next time you complain about government bureaucracy, remember it once used that same efficiency to catalogue children for exploitation. When modern life feels difficult, consider that your ancestors might have faced impossible choices about their children's futures. We live in an imperfect world, but it's a paradise compared to the Ottoman Empire's systematic exploitation. Your children can keep their names, their identities, their freedom intact. That basic human dignity, which we take for granted, was denied to millions for over 600 years. Historical perspective doesn't minimize current problems. It reminds us how far humanity has come. If this video disturbed you, good. History's darkest chapters should disturb us. They remind us what humans are capable of when power goes unchecked. Share this video to spread awareness about historical truths that mainstream education ignores. Subscribe to ensure you don't miss our next deep dive into history's hidden horrors. We're exposing the systems and empires that built their power on human suffering. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Were you taught any of this in school? What other historical horrors do you think have been sanitized or hidden? Hit the notification bell because YouTube doesn't always show our content to subscribers. Until next time, remember, those who forget history's horrors are doomed to enable their repetition.